27 years in Major League Soccer, one of the foundational clubs, the Originals, formerly known as the New York, New Jersey Metro Stars, now known as the New York Red Bulls. They fall to FC Cincinnati 2-1 Saturday, October 15th in the MLS Cup Playoffs, their first home playoff game since 2018. And yet again, disappointment for the New York Red Bulls fans. I'm James Birle alongside Nick Guzman. We've been covering the team all season long, beat reporting for the New York Red Bulls. We were there last Saturday night on that very, very fitting end to what looked like at points could be a promising season, but overall a disappointing year for the New York Red Bulls.
Yeah, and that game was really one that just summed up what we've seen all season every time we've gone to Red Bull Arena. It's been the Red Bulls' home record this year has been it's been the worst it's been in their entire history at Red Bull Arena since they've been there. It's a team who, you think back to a team in 2018 with Tyler Adams and Sean Davis in the midfield and all those players, Daniel Royer, and they had the best home record in MLS on their way to a Supporters' Shield. And then this year, things being so drastically different. And in that game, we saw Lewis Morgan score an absolute screamer to put New York up 1-0 in the first half. But then Morgan seemed like on that shot, injured his groin, had to be subbed off. Red Bull switched from a 4-back to a 3-back, and then immediately everything changed.
Well, once Dylan Nealis stepped on, he's been a big scapegoat for the Red Bulls this year, so we don't want to put it all on his shoulders now, but that substitution really was the spark for FC Cincinnati going forward. They controlled the entire second half. Penalty goal from Lucho Acosta. Jeff Cameron actually got one that was ruled back for offside, rightfully so, but it was all Cincy after the 50-minute mark, and they come away with a 2-1 win. It's Brandon Vasquez gets on the end of Sergio Santos' cross, leaves Aaron Long in the dust, and it's 2-1. Cincinnati, biggest win in their franchise history. Congratulations to them. But the New York Red Bulls, once again, find a way to disappoint their fans at Red Bull Arena this season. And that's really been the story all year long.
It has been the story all year long. And when you think about what happened in that game and what happened in the second half, we've seen so many times the Red Bulls start positively, whether it's in the first half or the beginning of the second half this year. Think about games against a team like Portland maybe or Minnesota, where it was a positive start, and then the foot comes off the gas, and in this case it was Cincinnati who, rightfully so, won the game and punished the Red Bulls on the counterattack. But I think this game really exemplified a lot of the larger themes that we've seen this season beyond just, the team not playing well at home. You think about positionally, you think about depth, you think about who the Red Bulls brought in during this season. In the middle of the season, they lost Tom Edwards, who went back to England. He was a big part of the back line. Red Bulls all season thin at wingback. It's been John Tolkien at left back, and then whoever wants to play at right back, whether it's Dylan Nealis, Kyle Duncan coming back on loan from Belgium. And that's been a position of weakness, especially when the Red Bulls play that 3 at the back system with the wingbacks who need to be so active. John Tolkien had a great year. He's going to do big things. We all know that. But on the other side, there was really no answers. I think that's a big part of the problem that we saw on Saturday afternoon, and then also just throughout this entire season.
Yeah, and you mentioned positive starts to matches. Well, let's just take a look at the season as a whole. They started the season incredibly positively on the road in their first 2 matches. Really statement wins against San Jose on the road. Obviously not the strongest team, and then Toronto, an even weaker side. They 3-1 and then 4-1, Lewis Morgan with the hat trick, and it really seemed like it was going to be a big, big year. And they followed that up with a crushing 1-0 loss at home to Minnesota United. We were both so there cold. For that. Freezing cold, and just a flat performance in that second half. You mentioned so many matches where they looked strong in the first half. A week later, we were there for Columbus, that 1-1 draw with Darlington Nagbe at the death. That first half was all Red Bulls. Then again on the road, coming away with wins against New England and Orlando City and Chicago, all in a row. They looked like road warriors in a way that we'd never seen them before. And I think it speaks to the youth on this team and just the mentality that they had. They went into every game on the road as underdogs, and it really, really fueled the way that this team plays. The Red Bulls like to give the other team the ball and like to react defensively, make it really difficult in their press, win the ball, and run down your throats. They did that at their best on the road. They had that underdog mentality going into games where they thought, we're out of our element, let's use that to our advantage, and it worked. At home, they never really quite found that, and this is where a lot of fans have become frustrated with Gerhard Struber, because in the Jesse Marsch era, and even sometimes in the Mike Petke era, where they tried to play really pretty soccer. Well, not really pretty soccer. That's a bit of a stretch. But under the Marsh era, where they really committed to the gegenpress, Red Bull energy drink style, what they did so well and what they were able to do on the road is this season is that they'd win the ball and immediately push forward, whereas it didn't seem like they had any ideas in the attack when they played at home this year, and sometimes on the road. But it just looked uninspired a lot and never quite clicked to a degree where we thought, man, this team is for real.
And the top teams, wherever you are in the world, have the ability to sit back on the road, hit you on the counter, use their speed in that way, but then at home can switch their tactics a little bit to be able to attack a low block and, exploit that and score goals at home and win games both at home and on the road. For whatever reason this year, whether it's the personnel, whether it's Gerhard Struber's tactical decisions, who he decided to play, whether it goes further into Red Bull's investment into the club, they could never figure out the proper way to win at home. And you and I talked, throughout the entire season that, at some point, they're going to click at home. And it just never did. It got March turned to April turned to May. We went through the summer. There were stretches in the summer where they looked better at home, wins against Toronto, wins against Atlanta United at home. Stronger showings where you think, okay, maybe this team is coming together at home, but then it's just more and more disappointing results as we turn to fall, and then now against Cincinnati.
Yeah, and again, just want to echo the point that bit of stubbornness from the Red Bulls at home. They never really adjusted to figuring out how to, get the better of teams that were going to sit back against them, but they came in with that underdog mentality again, and we, press conference after press conference with Gerhard Struber, he likes to deflect blame a lot. He got a lot of criticism from the Twitter experts for that, as he playfully commented after the loss to Cincinnati. Let's talk a bit about the Open Cup run, because that was probably the Red Bulls' best shot at getting a trophy this season. They opened it up against Hartford Athletic with not the most convincing win you'd like to have against a USL side, but they came away with a 2-1 win, followed that up with a 3-0 win on the road against their oldest rivals, DC United. DC United rotated the squad. Can't read too much into that. But the following game, you were there at home.
Montclair State
against Charlotte. Was that the best atmosphere the Red Bulls had this season?
It is, because Montclair State, much, much smaller than Red Bull Arena. It's really just one side of bleachers. It was full, all Red Bull fans. You could tell they were really feeding off the crowd in that performance. That was probably the most energized I've seen the team. It's also the press benches there. You're just sitting at the top of the bleachers. You're literally in the crowd. You are at Red Bull Arena, but even more so at Montclair State. And if you're going to a U.S. Open Cup game in the middle of the week, you're a diehard Red Bulls fan. That was the best atmosphere that they've had all season in that smaller venue. Then they take that one, go home against NYCFC in the Open Cup. Maybe the best performance they've had all year. Red card helped in that game. But in the second half, they really blew away NYCFC. And that led them to the semifinals where, you think about the things that happened in the Open Cup this year. This was a perfect opportunity for the Red Bulls to win the tournament. But in the semifinals, that So Metro kind of struck again.
Yeah, that NYCFC Red Bulls game was probably the bright spot in terms of footballing ability that we saw from the Red Bulls this year. I mean, that was the Luquinhas show at its best.
Playing so well.
And
he never really reached that level.
Never found it again. And that's really what killed the Red Bulls. When he first came into this season, I thought he was the best DP the Red Bulls have had in quite some time. I compared him often to Kaku. They had different styles of play, but similar impacts in that point of the year. However, we talk about big-time number 10 DPs in Major League Soccer. Nowadays, you think of Zelarayan, Mukhtar, Driussi. Luquinhas just isn't in that category.
Comfortable step below.
Yeah, and that's not good for the Red Bulls, especially because we talk about this for years and years since, Bradley Wright Phillips' departure. They haven't had a striker. They brought in Elias Manuel on loan. They still have their young DP and Patrick Klimala, who had 1 goal since May. And yeah, just to go back to that Orlando City Red Bulls Open Cup game, that was probably the most demoralizing defeat they had all year. Going up 1-0 in stoppage time of the first half and then not closing out that half 1-0 up, going 1-1 into half, really ruined that one, and that second half was just embarrassing on every level. The Barcelona game, we didn't get to go to that one, but that was a fun one. Another bright point on the season, just a little distraction from what went down in the in the midst of other home matches at Red Bull Arena.
And then
that
directly after that Barcelona game, I'd say it was probably a low point, that Colorado 5-4 game, just because of how incredibly disorganized everything looked. That second half is one of the craziest, sloppiest, at the same time entertaining second halves I've ever seen. That was against Colorado on August 2nd at Red Bull Arena. Red Bulls lost 5-4 in that one. But that's kind of when the momentum from the early summer, from this Open Cup run, the wins against Toronto and Atlanta, kind of faded away with that performance against Colorado.
Yeah, and that was probably the ugliest display that we saw all season. And I think you're right to say that it was a low point, specifically because we got denied of an all-time Tom Barlow moment in the 98th minute. Would have been the equalizer. Oh, man, I would have loved to have seen that. However, the Red Bulls followed that up with a draw against the worst team in the league, DC, a loss, again, to Orlando City at home. We were at that one. Another game where they looked really strong in the first half and crumbled. Then they go on the road and win against Atlanta, big win, draws against Cincinnati. And then we came to that game against Inter Miami, where we thought this is the playoff atmosphere that we're going to find in October. And this is the way that they want to play at home. That was probably, at Red Bull Arena, their best performance, probably the best game just overall. And that was when they started to ease back into that form that we thought, this is what this team can do. On the road, they're 4 days later, their biggest away win of the season, in my opinion, coming away with 3 points against Montreal, their first time doing that since 2012. And then we found ourselves struggling at home against league-leading Philadelphia, and pretty much the rest is history. Demoralizing against New York City and Columbus, a good win in decision day against Charlotte, but then a loss to Cincinnati in the playoffs.
And it's a season where a lot of ups and downs. People say that a lot about a lot of teams where it's not really relevant. But this is a Red Bull season that truly had fairly high peaks. The Open Cup game against NYCFC is a high peak. Some home wins, some big road wins against Atlanta United, a team that Red Bulls have so much history with in just the short time Atlanta's been in the league, played some great playoff games. And to go on the road to Mercedes-Benz and get a win there, that's a high point. But every high point seemed almost immediately followed by an incredible low point. And I just look and I think about the performances that we saw at Red Bull Arena. We saw a couple really good ones. That Miami one comes to mind after that Pozuelo red card in the first half. That was one of the first games where I noticed Daniel Edelman being really, really, really solid in the midfield. He later, the second half of the season, really cemented himself as a starter in that midfield. Kaden Clark got a goal in that game. We thought maybe, okay, now we're going to see more of Kaden Clark, who spent time at the U20 CONCACAF Championship. Also, just never really found his footing he hasn't found his footing since 2020, that pandemic season when he was going to be the next big thing. So you wondered about that, and that's sort of a depth piece that we were talking about, not really coming through, that this Red Bulls team is not anywhere near as deep as the other teams in Major League Soccer. And I think that sort of as we scroll through this schedule and you see the results, there was never really a consistent run of excellent form, both home and away. And you think despite that, the fact they finished fourth in the Eastern Conference and got a home playoff game is pretty remarkable, and it talks about the mentality of this team and what they did on the road, which is an incredible achievement, what this team did on the road. Just when you contrast it with how they played at home, it just doesn't quite, the full picture is not very pretty.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right about that. You talked about a guy like Daniel Edelman coming into the fold and, the lack of depth, and that's something that Gerhard Struber talked about a lot. He said in the press conference that he didn't think it would be realistic to expect much of a run in the playoffs from this team, despite comments he made last offseason. We don't know what the future of this team looks like for a lot of guys. Should we expect a major turnover with the squad and coaching staff? Because we don't know if Struber's coming back. There's a lot of other guys, Aaron Long, Christian Caceres, John Tolkien, all could make moves somewhere. Aaron Long obviously expected to stay within Major League Soccer. Tolkien and Caceres expected to go abroad sooner rather than later. So should we see a lot of new faces with the New York Red Bulls in a season to come?
I think so. To me, those Struber comments in that press conference, if they weren't intended to be final, they seemed final in the way he talked about his players and he talked about his bench compared to Cincinnati's bench, things like that. It seemed to me like whether it's going to be his decision to leave or whether the Red Bulls ask him to leave. I think we've seen the last of Gerhard Struber as the New York Red Bulls manager. And in terms of the squad, you've got Aaron Long potentially walking as a captain. I think you and I are both the same page as this. He's going to take probably a DP deal somewhere or just a deal for wherever you can get the most money in MLS right now. He's yeah.
I think LA Galaxy is probably going to be the biggest landing spot for him because they always just happen to have TAM money open and DP spots open every season. It's an unwritten MLS rule for sure. But with that said, John Tolkien is a guy who, 20 years old, is overworked like crazy on the left side. There's no backup for him. In the center back position without Aaron Long, it's going to be Andres Reyes, Sean Nealis moving forward. Carlos Cornell in goal, one of the league's best. Not as good as he was in 2021, but still you can build around him for sure. In central midfield, even if Caceres goes, they'll have cover with guys like Daniel Elderman and Frankie Amaya, who was elite in the first half of the season and started to come back into that form late on in the fall. And then you got a guy like Drew Yearwood, who had that crazy suspension against Philadelphia, but he can also be an elite center mid in this league. Let's talk about the strikers real quick because we talked about the payroll for the Red Bulls. It's the lowest in the league, but all that really indicates, because of the locked salary cap structure, is that they spend less on DPs. Lorenzo Insigne gets paid more than the entire Red Bulls payroll by about 40%, I think I read on Reddit this morning. Should the Red Bulls start to spend money like a team like Toronto? Because the Red Bulls are fourth in the Eastern Conference, had a home playoff game, albeit disappointed. 13 years running in the playoffs, would be 20 years had they not missed in 2009. So should the Red Bulls start paying a lot more? Red Bull certainly has the money. Is that going to be the recipe for success? Because spending a little on your DPs like Patrick Klimala hasn't worked out. They might have to offload him soon, and if they're going to commit to Elias Manuel, we don't know what Kyle Duncan's going to do. You'd have to pay him a hefty amount if he was going to stay long-term now because he's had the European interest. You can't expect him to come back and being paid the same amount as Dylan Nealis. So what should we see from a business perspective from the Red Bulls going forward?
From a business perspective, should they spend money to fill the obvious holes that are in the squad to push them into, maybe the LAFC level or the Philadelphia Union level that we've seen this year? Yes, they should do that. Are they going to do that? Probably not. Just because of what we've seen in the last decade from the way the New York Red Bulls run things from a management level. It's about youth development. It's about players like John Tolkien and Daniel Edelman coming through, Kyle Duncan, if you want to go back further, Tyler Adams, people like that, coming through and making impact on the first team and then possibly being sold on to Europe for a fee. And there's a way, in my opinion, that you can balance prioritizing the academy with bringing in high-money DPs who are going to help the team win. It's one thing bringing in a DP who's, a big name in Europe, who's past it, who's maybe he'll put some people in seats, but he's probably not going to impact them positively. But there's ways to get designated players that can fill the holes that are needed in this team that can make them even more competitive than they are. Because on paper, this is a team, if you look at the last decade of New York Red Bulls and their finishes in the Eastern Conference and MLS, they've won 2 Supporter Shields. Are consistently finishing in playoff positions. They just can never get over that hump. And I think some more investment would certainly help. But from the outside, this is a run and managed franchise from an on-field perspective and what they put on the field because it's consistently a good product that just can't ever get over the hump in the playoffs. I think some more investment's needed. And I think one of the reasons why it's more needed is just you and I were at Red Bull Arena all season. There wasn't a lot of people there a lot. The attendance was down, and you could blame, post-pandemic for that or whatever, but it's since 2017, 2018, it's been on a steady decline as other markets in MLS emerge and sell out their stadiums. So that's certainly worrying. But I think the way you put more people in the seats is by putting an entertaining product on the field. People don't really want to see a club who hardly ever wins at home at Red Bull Arena. And I think a designated player striker who's not Patrick Klimala will do that. And I think when there's not so many, but there's obvious holes that can be filled. If Aaron Long walks, you probably need another center back. John Tolkien can't play left back every single game. You're going to kill him. Right back, Dylan Nealis really was not good enough all season long. You need somebody there. those are spots that can easily be filled by some squad investment. I just don't really know if we're going to see it.
Yeah, I mean, you said it all. Let's try to talk some positives right now. Lewis Morgan, far and away this team's MVP this year. I mean, came over from Inter Miami where he scored all of 2 goals last season, but he was still probably their best player, which just speaks to how bad Inter Miami were last season and how bad they looked last night against New York City FC. However, I will say this, $1.1 million in GAM was an absolute steal, even though he was their best player and probably didn't get enough credit for doing that. Daniel Edelman, we mentioned. John Tolkien, we mentioned.
One healthy Christian Cáceres that are really solid.
Yeah, Christian Cáceres had some of the best numbers during the summer as a central midfielder in Major League Soccer. Andres Reyes, when he came back from injury, was probably the Red Bulls' best center back, even better than Long. Tom Edwards, losing him was probably the biggest blow that could have happened to this team, because we know how difficult, how much they struggled defending on the right side, and we never saw Reyes and Edwards share the field together. But back to the positives: 13 straight years into the MLS playoffs. That's tied for the longest run. Seattle just snapped their what would have been 14 this season, the CCL champions. They go to 13. Red Bulls 13. Next year they have a chance at breaking that record. Do you think they do it?
I think they do, because there's enough, no matter who the coach is and who's in the squad next year, there's going to be an academy player who takes the next step, whether that's Serge Goma or somebody like that, who are going to take the next step and really cement themselves into this team. I have a lot of confidence that they can make the playoffs again next year, but just the question is, we're talking about competing for MLS Cups. I think we both agree the Red Bulls right now are just a step behind maybe the elite of MLS right now.
Well, I don't think anybody can argue with that. The Red Bulls' home playoff game is their biggest achievement that they had in the season, finishing in the top 4 in the East. It's no easy task, 13 years running in the MLS Cup Playoffs. Unfortunately, they bounce out to FC Cincinnati 2-1 this past Saturday. Next season, 2023, hopefully big things to come for the New York Red Bulls. We had the absolute pleasure of being able to cover them for WFUV Sports this season. So thank you so much to everybody involved with WFUV Sports who made that possible for us. Hopefully we can get to a game or two next year, and hopefully we see a little bit more success, even though there was certainly success this year for the New York Red Bulls. It's not all negative, but it's certainly not all sunshines and rainbows. We'll see you guys hopefully next season with the New York Red Bulls. Maybe they'll get moved to Vegas, who knows. Anyway, for WFUV Sports, I'm James Birle. This is Nick Guzman. Thank you guys so much for joining our coverage this year with the Red Bulls. We'll see you guys next time.